Imagine a world where one empire ruled vast stretches of land across every continent. A single nation whose influence stretched from the sun-kissed shores of the Caribbean to the untamed jungles of India, and from the frozen plains of Canada to the sandy deserts of Africa. That empire was the British Empire, a colossal force that shaped the course of history in ways we are still feeling today. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and controversial stories in world history, the rise and fall of the British Empire. From its humble beginnings in the 16th century to the powerful empire at its height, and eventually to its transformation into the Commonwealth. Stick around as we uncover how this empire changed the world and left a legacy that continues to shape nations today. But before we begin, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new history dive with us. To understand the British Empire, we need to start at the very beginning, before it was even an empire. The story begins in the 15th century, during the Age of Discovery. England, a small island off the coast of Europe, was far from the global superpower it would eventually become. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, European powers began to venture out into the world, seeking new trade routes and lands. But it was not until the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, in the late 16th century, that England began to seriously pursue an overseas empire. This was the age of piracy, privateers, and exploration. It was also the era that saw the birth of the English East India Company, which would grow into one of the world's most powerful commercial entities. England's first true foothold in the Americas came in 1585 with the establishment of the colony of Roanoke in North America. Though it ultimately failed, it marked the beginning of a more serious attempt at colonization. The 17th century brought England into competition with other European powers, particularly Spain, France, and the Dutch. But what set England apart? The answer lies in two things: the rise of the British Navy and the establishment of the first permanent colonies. From the Caribbean to India, the British Empire began to grow, and it was propelled by trade, exploration, and military might. By the early 1700s, England had firmly established itself in the Americas and the West Indies, creating a lucrative trade network based on sugar, tobacco, and enslaved labor. However, the real turning point came with the British East India Company's influence in India. After several battles, like the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company cemented British dominance in India. This wasn't just about land, it was about resources, power, and establishing an empire that stretched halfway around the globe. And of course, with colonial expansion came conflict. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, a global conflict, saw Britain fight for control of vast territories against France. By the end of the war, Britain had emerged victorious and was solidifying its control over Canada, India, and the Caribbean. Now, we come to the 19th century, often considered the height of the British Empire. At its peak, Britain controlled 1/4 of the world's landmass and 1/5 of its population. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, which transformed Britain into the world's leading economic and military power. Britain wasn't just a dominant naval power, it was the engine of global trade, with the Industrial Revolution fueling the expansion of railroads, steamships, and factories. The empire's reach extended across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Colonies in Africa, like Kenya and South Africa, began to emerge, while in Asia, India, Hong Kong, and Singapore became key parts of the empire. Britain's power and wealth were built on colonial exploitation. Resources from India, the Caribbean, and Africa flooded Britain, helping fund its growing industrial might. But this period was also marked by massive inequality, as native populations were subjected to harsh rule and economic exploitation. Take India, for example. The British Raj, established in 1858, was a period of direct British rule in India after the East India Company was dissolved following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. While Britain built railroads, schools, and telegraph lines in India, it also created a system that left the country economically and politically subjugated. As the world entered the 20th century, the British Empire began to show cracks. World War I, while a victory for the Allies, drained Britain's resources and left the empire weakened. The cost of maintaining colonies, the rise of nationalist movements, and the increasing pressure for self-determination in the colonies were all signs that the empire's days were numbered. Then came World War II. The conflict not only destroyed much of Europe but also accelerated the decline of the British Empire. The war left Britain deeply in debt, and colonies like India, which had long struggled for independence, began to demand their freedom more forcefully. In 1947, India gained independence, marking the beginning of the end for British colonial rule. And it wasn't just India. In the decades that followed, African nations, Caribbean islands, and other colonies began to push for and achieve independence. By the 1960s and 70s, many of the British colonies had gained independence, and Britain's imperial control over its vast empire was rapidly shrinking. Though the British Empire officially ended, its legacy didn't disappear. In 1949, the British Commonwealth was formed, a voluntary association of former colonies and territories that remained connected to the UK in some way. Today, the Commonwealth includes over 50 countries, such as Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa. From language and legal systems to politics and trade, the British Empire left its mark on every corner of the globe. English is now the most widely spoken second language, and British traditions, sports, and culture continue to influence many nations. But the British Empire's legacy is complex. While it brought modernization and infrastructure to some parts of the world, it also left behind a history of exploitation, inequality, and division. Many former colonies are still dealing with the long-term effects of British rule, including economic challenges and social divides. But there's also a strong sense of pride in their independence and sovereignty. Today, nations that were once part of the British Empire stand as independent and proud countries, but they still share a connection to the past, whether through cultural ties, trade relationships, or the enduring legacy of the Commonwealth. Beyond politics and economics, the British Empire left a massive cultural footprint. This wasn't just about controlling land or resources, it was about spreading ideas, shaping identities, and creating a shared language that would go on to bridge continents. Let's talk about some of these enduring cultural legacies. One of the most visible reminders of British colonialism is in the architecture. Cities like New Delhi, Cape Town, and Sydney are dotted with grand colonial buildings, from government offices to schools and railways. These buildings tell the story of an empire that imposed its vision of civilization on distant lands. But the British Empire's influence didn't stop at bricks and mortar. The English language itself became a tool of both unification and domination. Today, English is the third most spoken language in the world, but it's the official language in over 50 countries. In places like India, Kenya, and Singapore, English is often the language of business, government, and higher education. While some view the spread of the English language as a form of cultural imperialism, others see it as a bridge to global communication and commerce. In fact, English has become the international language of diplomacy, science, technology, and entertainment. Then, there's the matter of sport. Football, or soccer, depending on where you're from, rugby and cricket all owe their origins to Britain, and these games are now played and loved around the world. Cricket, for example, became a powerful unifying force in countries like India, where the sport transcended colonial boundaries and is now a cultural phenomenon. British education also left a significant mark, particularly in the establishment of schools and universities. British-style education systems still thrive in many former colonies, though many of these institutions have evolved to better serve local needs and identities. Interestingly, British colonial rule wasn't just about imposing culture, it also led to the blending and fusion of local traditions with British customs. Take the Caribbean, for example. Colonial rule influenced everything from the food to the festivals. Today, celebrations like the Notting Hill Carnival in London reflect this complex blend of African, Caribbean, and British culture. One of the most controversial and significant impacts of the British Empire was economic. The empire was a global economic machine that extracted resources from its colonies to fuel Britain's industrial revolution and global trade network. But the question remains, who really benefited from this wealth? In the Caribbean, sugar plantations relied on enslaved labor, while in Africa, rubber and mineral resources like gold and diamonds were exploited for Britain's gain. In India, the British controlled the production of tea, cotton, and indigo, taking these goods to British factories and ports to fuel their growing industrial economy. The economic policies of the British Empire were designed to benefit Britain. Many colonies were seen as mere suppliers of raw materials. Local industries in places like India were often stifled, as British companies took over key sectors like textiles, severely disrupting local economies. And we can't forget about the transatlantic slave trade. British ships were at the heart of one of the most horrific human trafficking enterprises in history, forcibly transporting millions of Africans to the Americas, where they worked on plantations under brutal conditions. This tragedy fueled much of the empire's wealth in the 17th and 18th centuries. While the British Empire was thriving off these industries, local populations often saw little to no benefit. In many cases, they were subjected to unfair taxes, harsh working conditions, and exploitation. The desire for economic independence was one of the key motivators for the independence movements that eventually broke free from colonial rule. The lasting economic legacy of the British Empire is still felt today. Many former colonies still deal with the ramifications of colonial economic policies. Economic systems built to serve the interests of the empire often left local populations impoverished. India's path to independence was long and tumultuous, marked by peaceful resistance led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Their campaign of non-violent protest and civil disobedience eventually led to the British withdrawal from India in 1947, a landmark event that inspired other colonies to demand their own independence. In Africa, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa were at the forefront of independence movements. The years following World War II saw an accelerated push for self-rule. Ghana became the first African nation to gain independence in 1957, setting off a wave of decolonization across the continent. The Caribbean was no different. By the 1960s, countries like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados had gained independence. However, the transition was rarely easy. Many former colonies struggled with the legacies of colonial rule, including economic dependency, social inequality, and political instability. By the 1970s, most of the British Empire had fallen apart as one colony after another gained independence. But this wasn't just about the end of colonial rule, it was the beginning of a new chapter in history. After World War II, the British Empire gave way to the Commonwealth of Nations, an organization that included former colonies, independent nations, and the UK. But while the empire dissolved politically, the cultural, economic, and political ties remained strong. The Commonwealth exists today as a voluntary association of 56 countries, most of which were once part of the British Empire. It focuses on promoting peace, democracy, and sustainable development. However, it's also a reminder of the complex history that binds these nations together. Many Commonwealth countries, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have retained strong ties to the British Crown, while others, like India and South Africa, have forged their own paths as republics. Still, they share a common heritage and continue to work together on issues such as trade, diplomacy, and climate change. Yet, the legacy of the British Empire remains a topic of heated debate. Some view the Commonwealth as a symbol of unity and cooperation, while others see it as a reminder of the colonial past and the exploitation that accompanied it. So, what can we learn from the history of the British Empire? It was a story of triumph and tragedy, of progress and exploitation, of unity and division. It was an empire built on the backs of millions of people, many of whom were denied their basic rights. Yet, the legacy of the British Empire is still felt today. The language, culture, and systems it left behind continue to shape the modern world. The Commonwealth serves as a reminder of both the connections and the complexities that arise from colonialism. The British Empire may be gone, but its story is far from over. The history of empire reminds us of the need to examine the past in order to understand the present. As we look toward the future, We must acknowledge the mistakes of the past and strive for a more just and equitable world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. It's been a long ride, but one worth taking. Let us know what you think about the British Empire's legacy in the comments below. And if you found this exploration of history fascinating, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning.